Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I'm your host, Kiana Canada. Welcome back to Kiana's show. Before we get into tonight's topic, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Remember that your likes and your shares, what it does is it pushes videos like this up in the algorithm. It tells the algorithm that videos like this are important. But we must be reminded, ladies and gentlemen, because this kind of content is not pushed up in the algorithm, that is not an indication that it's not important. And I am calling on you to like this video, to share it, and subscribe to this channel. I am currently undergoing transnational repression, and I talk about transnational repression a lot on this channel. And so my channel is being shadow banned to some degree. And because it's being shadow banned, I am asking for you to like the videos, to share it, and subscribe to the channel. If you look on this channel and you go throughout this entire channel, you're not going to see any comments. You're not going to see any likes. And that's on over 200 plus videos that I've uploaded to this channel. This is because of transnational repression. And if you do see comments, like especially you'll see comments where you have an informant working on the behalf of intelligence agencies criticizing the video. These are not genuine comments. There are comments from, to reiterate, informants or proxies working on the behalf of intelligence agencies. And so I would appreciate if you find the information useful in this video, that you like it and that you share it and that you have a conversation about it. So in this video, our discussion is really going to revolve around radical victimology. And so what is radical victimology? Radical victimology concerns itself with victims of police force. So for example, police brutality, extrajudicial executions, victims of war, victims of the correctional system, the victims of state violence, and the victims of oppression of any sort. And radical victimology, it argues that the activities of the powerful and the privileged are either beyond criminal law, and that state agents rarely appear in court or rarely ever appear or rarely ever incarcerated for their crimes. And we are going to be discussing, getting into this, ladies and gentlemen. And so following that, there are a couple of news stories that I want to use to undergird the previous video essays that I uploaded. And if you have an opportunity, I would urge you to watch those video essays. One is episode 113, Unpacking the Parasitic Behavior of Irish and American Cyber Intelligence Operations. And then episode 109, Dangers of Irish American Intel Agencies Forming Parasocial Relationships with Their Subjects. And I believe that these articles that I am going to discuss today, I believe what it does is that that it supports and undergirds those conclusions that I've made in those two videos. And those conclusions that I made in those two videos, episode 113, so episode 113 and episode 109, these conclusions are extrapolated from past research and video essays that I've done. And so let's go ahead and get into this evening's topic. So the Irish News published an article called Call for Review of PSNI MI5 Relationship in Wake of Neo-Nazi X Scandal. Regrettably, this article was behind a paywall, and so I did not get the opportunity to read the article. That could change the moment that this live stream ends, that article will be available. But what I have noticed living in the Republic of Ireland, as well as living in Northern Ireland, is that a lot of the articles that are detailing how the state commits crimes or the state is implicated in crimes appear to be behind a paywall. And I think that is regrettable, because what it does is it partitions us from having access to credible sources of information, and it sort of creates a conduit to where we as the public seek information from other online sources that could be disinformation and misinformation. That is not to argue that independent sources are not creditable. They are creditable in many instances, but what we have come to understand is that journalists, some journalists, they have institutions to back them up in their research. So in many instances, journalists are able, if you're working for the BBC or you're working for The Guardian, you're able to, you have the resources to where you can engage in investigative journalism and talk to sources, pay sources, and communicate with sources, and really put out authentic, credible pieces of information. And I want to restate, that is not an argument that independent news sources or citizen journalists don't put out credible pieces, because they do in some instances. But I did have access to this story from The Guardian, who published the piece that says, MI5 reprimanded for lying about ties with neo-Nazi who attacked girlfriend. And I believe that piece that was published by Dan Saba was building on the piece that was published by Daniel DeSimone. And that piece, his article, the title of that is Agent X, a foreign neo-Nazi misogynist who used his security role as a tool of abuse. And I want to talk about this and sit in the exedra and talk about, once again, state agents misusing their intelligence capacities to harm victims in the public. As you know, my research surrounded around transnational repression and state crime. For the past 5 to 6 years, I have been studying transnational criminology, transnational cybercrime, and state crime. When I was at Queen's University, I sought to write my dissertation on transnational repression, but the state impeded my research on that critical area. by blocking my dissertation and sanctioning me by having me expelled from Queen's University Belfast after I ended my contract for human rights abuses on campus, as well as various breaches of the contract. So that was really disturbing, I think, in my particular situation, because I had gathered all these research articles which the state was intercepting and reading, and then using what was in those articles to retaliate against me and to re-victimize me, just as it did with my memoir. So I published a memoir called Running from Empty Shoes. And what happened was the state read through my memoir and was finding sensitive pieces and pressure points, and would take some of the sensitive areas out of context, and then taking situations that happened to me, and what it would do is use those situations to re-victimize me. And we are going to be discussing that in another video, because I really want to do that video justice. How intelligence agencies, what they do is they engage in this parasocial relationship with their subjects. And again, sometimes the parasocial relationship is very parasitic and not at all friendly. And we're going to get into that. So to restate, I really want to do that piece justice. And so I am still researching how to best put that piece together. But in Daniel DeSimone's piece that was published, in the BBC, we learned that there was a neo-Nazi who was a confidential informant for the PSNI or the MI5, and was working on behalf of these intelligence agencies. Now, the pieces that I read did not expound on how the intelligence agencies were using Agent X, is what they call them. It doesn't really expound on that. And to be fair, there could be more information about his role in previous articles. And while that may be important, in this video, I really want to focus on the parasitic aspect of the behavior that Daniel DeSimone speaks about, and that we see across film as well as with lived experience. And so in that piece, we learned that MI5 gave false evidence to 3 courts about this confidential informant, this neo-Nazi. And what is deeply regrettable is that we learn that he assaulted and abused his girlfriend, and was using, that's what the title says, and was using his role, his intelligence role, as a tool of abuse. And so why do I bring this up? Well, my argument is that male cyber intelligence agents and cyber hackers often develop a one-sided negative parasocial connection with their subjects, treating them with possessiveness that mimics coercive control. In Daniel DeSimone's piece, it is clear that the Agent X had some relationship that was bilateral or mutual with his victim, right? But for many victims who are on the opposite end of this victimization, there is not a mutual relationship. There is not a bilateral relationship. Oftentimes it's unilateral. And I think that Daniel DeSimone's piece undergirds my claim of interpretation that men in intelligence often do victimize their subjects. Now, I want to look at parasocial relationships. So Peirce and Rubin, they argue that parasocial interactions are based on vicarious interactions rather than actual interactions. And in my detailed explication on state crime, of course, in videos 113 and 109, I speak in detail, building on scholarship, how intelligence agencies build these relationships with people like you and I, and people like the victim in Daniel DeSimone's piece, except I think in that case, that relationship was built possibly before he started to inform for the intelligence agency. It's not readily clear. But at any rate, I think in an ordinary situation, like the situation that you and I find myself in, we come to understand that these intelligence agencies, the men working within these agencies, are building these parasocial relationships with their victims and harming them through their parasocial connection. Now, imagine how, I want you to think about like friendships or relationships or competition or battling a person, right? And you see parasocial connections happening sometimes if you watch a television series. That often happens, right? Like you see a character on a series, a television show, or in a movie, and you're like, I'm rooting for that person to win. Like I love how they wrote this character. I wish that this was a real life person, you know, today, right? And I think when we look at that, right, that is, I think, a healthy connection that cannot be taken out of context, because we all as humans, we all have people in film that we do like. Like, I think if I ask you, like, who is your favorite movie star? You're going to tell me, well, my favorite movie star is this person. And I'm going to ask you, well, what do you like about this person or their character arc? And you're able to describe that in detail to me. And that is completely normal and natural, right? But what's not normal is where you have an intelligence agency, or, and I'm using the agency, and I'm personifying the intelligence agency, but it's probably better to say the intelligence operative as a person who is surveilling their subject, engaging in or living out a parasocial connection. Now, in my specific situation, I don't think that the intelligence operative's behavior is friendly or that they seek a relationship from me. I look at it more as competitive and as more as aggressive and harmful. And a lot of victims of cybercrime and cyber harassment experience the same. And so in my particular situation, these communications are not unilateral, right? I, as a victim of cybercrime, I, as a victim of cyber harassment, don't want to experience this on a day-to-day basis. And for victims of transnational repression, for victims that are experiencing cyberbullying and cyber intimidation, some people can go through this years. I've gone through it for 5 to 6 years. Some people often go through it 10 years. Some people go through it a lot less. But just think about it. For some intelligence operatives, cyber hackers, this is a day-to-day business for them. This is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week activity for them. So think about it. You have a person behind a computer, and that their job is to surveil you, to intimidate you, and to harass you online. And they're doing this 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It's quite distressing for some people. And so in my previous video, I argue that this is a subset of hegemonic masculinity. And to provide an anecdotal example, I point to the relationship between Doug Stamper and Rachel Posner in the series House of Cards. As we know, this relationship between Doug Stamper and Rachel Posner was a transactional arrangement. And what's deeply concerning is that Posner, when she asserted her independence, Stamper's admiration mutated into control and dark obsession. And that control escalated, where Stamper resorted to violence and continued to surveil Posner, monitoring her movements, and he eventually unalived her, which was so frightening. And so when we look to Doug Stamper's behavior in the House of Cards series, it was quite evident that he unalived Rachel Posner because she had evidence of the illegal behavior that took place within the administration in that show, right? So I guess he was hearkened back to the very fact that Rachel Posner held evidence that could implicate him, as well as the president in House of Cards in various state crimes, and unalived her to keep her silent, which was deeply concerning. But what does this reveal? Like the surveillance aspect, the monitoring Rachel Posner's movements. Because in House of Cards, what we did see is we seen Rachel Posner crossing the street, living her own life, moving on with her life, and we seen Doug Stamper monitoring her movements. And I think that what this reveals is antisocial behavior, engaging in activities like cyber harassment, cyberbullying, and cyber fraud. And you may argue, well, Kiana, he didn't appear to cyberbully her or cyber harass her. He just surveilled her. But surveillance is a form of harassment. To be sure, I think that what it does is it amplifies dark traits. As we look at cyber psychopathy, the digital realm acts as a a psychological amplifier where individuals who may already possess certain tendencies can more easily act hostile and engage in antisocial behaviors. Now, what does that look like? Well, it looks like intelligence agencies stopping a person from communicating with people outside of their home online. Bullying them. What does bullying look like? Sending them negative messages, sending them dark messages, sending them nasty messages, messages in a way that tends to degrade and humiliate the victim. What does cyber fraud look like? Well, cyber fraud is intercepting the person's credentials, their passwords, not only intercepting the person's passwords, but also intercepting their bank details, stealing their money. Not only doing that, but changing their password, changing their username, intercepting their email communications, altering their communications, altering their university assessments, changing A, B, C, D. This is cyberbullying, cyber harassment, and cyber fraud. It's a tripartite test to some degree. You have cyberbullying, cyber harassment, and cyber fraud. And what's deeply disturbing is that intelligence agencies often contract cyber hackers, so they will often groom university students who are studying IT, get them while they're very young and impressionable, and mold their mind into engaging in this kind of criminal activity. And then you have cyber hackers working for, so external cyber hackers working for intelligence agencies to carry out this behavior so that it never ever is connected to the intelligence agency and the officials that are working within these departments. And I want you to just reflect on that for a moment. I want you to reflect on what it must feel like for a victim to have to go through this. In my own personal case, I reported the cyber intimidation, the cyber harassment, the collection and interception of my Aspen card credentials, the various putting malware on my devices. I actually lost a tablet that was that the cyber hackers, the intelligence agencies ruined. They ruined a phone. When I was in the Republic of Ireland, I had a computer, or a laptop, an Apple laptop, and they actually put spyware and malware on my Apple laptop. And what was regrettable is I had to sell it because I was in a vulnerable state and in a need of desperation, because I needed to get out of the Republic of Ireland because of the intimidation and the actions of the state. I was forced and compelled to sell my laptop to a place for a very low price, which was likely worth more than I got for it. I think I sold it for like £40. When I think back to that, like I'm so disgusted that like I was in a position to where I was taken advantage of because I sought to remove myself from such a frightening situation. And so, to reiterate, I had to sell my Apple laptop for a very low price. And then I eventually got another laptop because I was in university and I had to take out student loans, and was able to buy another laptop. And then the intelligence agencies put malware on that laptop as well. And so I said, okay, well, there's just no use in having a laptop at this moment. And I sold that one, I think, for like $70. But the first $40 was for me to eat because I didn't have anything to eat during the last couple of weeks when I was in the Republic of Ireland. So I had to sell it for food. And then the last laptop, I had used that to catch, not to catch, but to buy a bus ticket to get out of the Republic of Ireland. And so all of those devices that I had, the 2 laptops, and then I had a phone in the Republic of Ireland that they put malware on. And then when I got here, then I had a phone that someone gave me, and then the intelligence agencies put malware on that phone so it wouldn't work. And so I couldn't make calls from it. I couldn't scroll. I couldn't search the internet. And then I eventually got a tablet, and then they put malware on that tablet. And you see, like, this was an ongoing process of victimization by people working in intelligence. And the Guardia Síochána never once researched this or investigated it. Not once sat me down and tried to understand my victimization. Not once did they try and take any details from me, which leads me to believe that they were complicit in it, if not actively engaged in it, which is deeply concerning. At one point, when I tried to have a conversation with the Guardia Síochána, the Guardia officer yelled and screamed at me and said, "I don't want to hear your geopolitical bullshit." When I came to Northern Ireland, I engaged with the PSNI on multiple occasions. When I first got here, I was trying to build trust with the PSNI, and often when these actions happened, I went to the police station, and I honestly believe that intelligence agencies were using those. So of course they have surveillance in the PSNI, but I think that they were using my reporting crimes at the PSNI to tell a more insidious story. But in Northern Ireland, I've never been arrested, never been held in detention in Northern Ireland. The only time that I have engaged with the police here in Northern Ireland is when I'm reporting a crime that they refuse to investigate. So I've reported cybercrime to the Police Service of Northern Ireland, to the National Crime Agency, to the Home Office, and not once did any of these agencies sit me down, have a serious discussion with me, take down evidence, and treated me like a victim or a person that was harmed. And this, I think, informs our understanding, right, of radical victimology, because here we have this state that is contributing to the victimization of a person who is already victimized. So not only was I victimized by these cyber hackers or proxies or these intelligence officials, but now I'm being victimized by the police agencies who have a duty to investigate this kind of crime and have chosen not to because of my being a complex victim. So later we are going to talk about ideal victimology, so being the ideal victim. But what is being a complex victim? Well, a complex victim is a person who is not necessarily an ideal victim. A complex victim is somebody who may have a checkered past, who may, when we look at the Troubles and we see that there was contentious activities on both sides, and so with the Catholics and the Protestants, this infighting happening on both sides. Some of those persons were actively engaged in wrongdoing on both sides. And when those persons when they were harmed by the other side, so when one person was harmed by one side, another person was harmed by the other side, what was deeply concerning is that they weren't looked to some degree as an ideal victim because of the role that they played, in these disputes. And so I think that was one way to look at complex victimhood. Another way to look at being a complex victim is when we look at child soldiers, right? When we look to the Middle East or the Gulf states and you have children that are actively partaking in war, and they're trained regrettably at a very young age to participate in war, and they're harmed, and sometimes when they grow up and they're put into prison, we can look at those children as complex victims because of the very fact that yes, they were a victim, but they were engaged in this behavior through possibly indoctrination or by virtue of their circumstances, right? And so during my extramural education, this was after I ended my contract with Queen's University Belfast, I continued my research on transnational criminology, transnational crime, and also state crime. And what I learned during my extramural education is that what is so unfortunate is that victims of transnational repression, especially Black victims of transnational repression, their voices are often silenced. As you know, like I said, when I was at the university, I sought to fill the lacuna in the research. So there was a populational gap, an empirical gap, also a theoretical gap, and sought to really focus in on those gaps to fill them up and to ensure that all voices were uplifted and heard. But I think what's unfortunate about this is that I wasn't able to do that because my reporting was my research was on states within the global south, so that, not the global south, but states within the global north, which was the Republic of Ireland, the United States of America, Northern Ireland. These were the states that were actively putting me through transnational repression. So my ethnographical or autoethnographical experience would detail how this takes place and how victims experience it, what are the methods that they use to put victims like myself through transnational repression. And we know that the state stopped that research. I want to go back to Daniel DeSimone's piece, because in Daniel DeSimone's piece, we do see that a victim of an intelligence agency, operatives working in an intelligence agency, a victim of an informant with ties to an intelligence agency, appeared to have her voice heard and appeared to get redress of some sort. And we may ask why that is. Was this victim an ideal victim? And we're going to go into that. But first, I want to clarify that I believe that the victim was British. And so that could lend itself to the very fact that she was seen as a victim. And we'll go into how people that are within the dominant society are often seen as victims, whereas people that are not, such as minorities and Black people, aren't seen as victims. The ideal victim comes from Niall Christie's work, and Niall Christie has 5 attributes of what makes an ideal victim. The first is that the victim is weak. The second is that the victim was carrying out a respectable project. The third is that she was in a place where she could not possibly be blamed for being. The fourth is that the offender was big and a bad person. The fifth is that the offender was unknown to the victim, and the victim didn't have a personal relationship with the aggressor, and the aggressor didn't have a personal relationship with the victim. And so looking back at Daniel DeSimone's piece, was the victim of Agent X an ideal victim? So let's go through that. Well, we would argue yes, because in comparison to a man who has ties to intelligence, working in an intelligence agency as an operative or an informant, I think we could all agree that in comparison to a person without that kind of power would be seen as weak. So there was a neo-Nazi called Agent X who had these ties to intelligence, and that made him more powerful than his victim who didn't have any ties to an intelligence agency. The victim was carrying out a respectable project. Well, that project could very well be that she was a mother, or she was I forget what they call these relationships where you're living together, common law relationships, that's what we call it in the United States, where you're living together as if you were married, but you're not actually like a married couple. So she could very well be in a common law relationship with the victim, with the perpetrator. And to some degree, being a wife or a stay-at-home mom or a girlfriend, that would seem to support the argument that she was carrying out a project that has some sort of respect attached to it. She was in a place where she was entitled to be and couldn't blame for being there. Well, I don't think that we could blame a person for being in their home, and the very fact that there's domestic violence taking place, this person lives in their home And so you can't say, well, you should not have been there. Well, no, you live there. So it's unfortunate that you are being attacked by your significant other, and that there is this kind of activity taking place. The aggressor was big and bad. When we look at the victim compared to this neo-Nazi who had ties to the police service of Northern Ireland and MI5, could we argue that this person was big and bad? Yeah, maybe there's an argument for that. I don't know what he looks like physically. Maybe I'll look for him if they release that information. Right now they're calling him Agent X, so there's not enough information as of yet to distinguish by looking at him, his physicality, whether or not he's big and bad. But if we tie his connections to the institutions such as the MI5 and police agencies, yeah, there could be a very strong argument that this person was big and bad, especially their ties to neo-Nazism. But the last attribute fails the archetype of the ideal victim, because the victim knew her aggressor. So of the 5 attributes, only 4 meet the definition that this person was an ideal victim. Now, the reporting that's out today isn't detailed enough to really expound on the victim's personality or her physicality or anything about her. And I must admit, there are some limitations to my analysis because I read a couple of reports, watched a couple of videos, and I'm sure, as you know, this case dates back, a year or so. And so there's more information. But there is a possibility, perhaps I will follow up on this story and add to it. But at this moment, I would have to be honest to say I'm not really sure the identity or anything about the victim. And I think that that's protected and it's kept confidential because the very fact that she is a victim of abuse. And as you can see, I want to reiterate that her status falls, there's an element, an attribute missing. So she possibly meets 4 of the attributes, but the last attribute she doesn't meet. But she was still seen as a victim, an ideal victim, in the eyes of the British media, because several publications, the BBC covered it, and now other publications are covering it as well. But I think what's regrettable here is that not everyone is seen as an ideal victim, such as Black women and sometimes Black trans women. So Black women in the United States of America, Black trans women in the United States of America, and as well as Black people, Black Americans within the Republic of Ireland that are living abroad, Black Americans that are living abroad here in Northern Ireland are often not seen as a victim. And why is that? Well, Black people, Black Americans are often viewed as being strong. Black Americans are often thought of as not carrying out a project that we can respect. And these are all alleged. Black Americans aren't there's an argument that, oh, well, they can protect themselves or they can advocate for themselves, or, you know, they're strong enough to speak up for themselves. And then when we look at Black Americans compared to their offenders, especially if they're a member of the dominant society, we're often looked as bigger when we're not bigger. So, for example, in my own case, when I was dealing with the intimidation and the harassment of the security guards at the home office, even in that situation, when it was clear that these security guards were not only taller and bigger than me, but they were also, you know, in size, you know, their mass was bigger than me, I was still looked at as a person who was the aggressor. And that was, I think, what was deeply disturbing. Even at the Queen's Film Theater, when I published that video, in that video you can see that the male worker who I think was like the manager that worked at Queen's Film Theater, he pushed my phone in my face, where my phone hit my face. That wasn't the only assault on me. He tackled me and hurt my back that day. Like, my back was so in so much pain because, like, the way in which he grabbed me, like I could see like the rage. It was so, ladies and gentlemen, I could see the rage coming out of his eyes. It was like, the moment that it happened, it was quite frightening. But when I look at it now, or when I think back to it now, all I can do is just laugh at it, because even in that situation, I was looked at as the person who was causing trouble, when it was really this person working at Queen's Film Theater who was bigger than me in body mass, who was taller than me, who actually put his hands on me by tackling me, hurting my back. Rage was in his eyes. I could see the hatred coming out of his eyes when he tackled me. And I could see the hatred in his eyes when he pushed my phone in my face as well. Like, it was so much hate that I could see coming out of his eyes and his demeanor. And so, why was I not seen as a victim in these situations? Well, I wasn't seen as a victim because of my race, my skin color. Had the shoe been on the other foot, let's say, for instance, when they tackled me, I tackled them back, or I hit them, or I pushed them back, I would have been seen as the aggressor. And we need to sit with that truth, and we need to ask ourselves, why? Why are members in the dominant society allowed to get away with these kinds of crimes, whereas other people can't protect themselves? For example, ladies and gentlemen, there was a video of an Afghan couple who they possibly, the female in this couple likely meets the definition of the ideal victim. You know, perhaps compared to these teenagers, she was weaker than them. Maybe she was carrying out a project that is respectable. For example, just walking in the park during the daytime. You know, she was somewhere, or maybe the project is that she was with her husband and they were on holiday or they were visiting this area. So there's nothing negative to look at about that project. She was where she could not be blamed for being. Well, you're in a park that's open to the public. It's during the daytime, so you can't be blamed for being there. The offender was big and bad. Well, the teenager was not bigger than this woman, so that attribute fails the traditional archetype 5-part test of being an ideal victim. And the offender was unknown to this woman. So there's 4 in this case as well, where all 5 attributes are not met in the person as seen as the ideal victim, because that was reported in the news. And what I found so surreal about that story is where the husband, this is what made me talk about it in the first place. This is what made me talk about it now. This is my first time talking about it. But this, what I'm about to tell you, is why I felt that story was so important. The husband said they were slapping his wife and he felt he could not do anything about it. And the shame that brought him. Because if he tried to protect his wife, then what would have happened? Well, there would have been, tension, escalating, allegations of all sorts, right? And where did we see this before? Where did we see this before in film? We've seen this in the movie Crash. Remember in the movie Crash, you had, I forget her last name, but her real name is Thandie Lewis. I think it's Thandie Lewis, Thandie Newton or something like that. And Terrence Howard, they played a couple. A very wealthy couple, rich couple, but they were stopped by the police. And when they were stopped by the police, they were asked to exit their vehicle. And they did so. And there was some back and forth between Thandie and the police officer. And the body search that the police officer conducts on Thandie is so disgusting and invasive and heinous. And Terrence Howard, in that film, all he could do was stand there and watch his wife being assaulted. Because if he intervened, we knew what would happen. If he tried to protect his wife or say, "Get your hands off my wife, don't touch her," we knew what would happen. Same thing in my case. When I was tackled by that security guard at Queen's University, Belfast, Queen's Film Theatre, not that security guard, when I was tackled by that manager that worked at Queen's Film Theatre, when he pushed my phone into my face, I knew that if I responded, I would have been seen as the bad person. I would have likely been arrested, because that's the narrative that they're trying to create. And they're able to get away with this time and time again, time and time again, time and time again, without my having any redress for their illegal behavior. And in another video, I'll explain why that is. But see, that was just one encounter. Another encounter was where a security guard crushed my knee into the door of the student union at Queen's University, Belfast. And then another incident was where I was trying to deliver the writ of summons to Queen's University personnel, and had security guards at Queen's University, Belfast, stopping me from engaging in a respectable project, impeding, standing in my path. And then when I screamed for help and screamed for intervention, I had a police officer that was undercover push me all the way to the wall. In my research and one of my assessments, I write how, and while I was fighting the disciplinary proceedings at Queen's University, one thing that I wrote about, while they were, of course, these intelligence agencies and operatives were surveilling my computer activity, one thing that I wrote about is that a person should not be pushed to the wall. And that was a very interesting quote. And right after I published that, I had this undercover police officer push me like all the way to the wall. It was almost like, it was crazy. It really was. It was violent and aggressive. The behavior of that undercover police officer was so violent and so aggressive. So let's think about all these situations. And then I have another incident. When I got to Northern Ireland, for the first few days, I was homeless because the Irish government, their intelligence personnel, and the U.S. intelligence personnel was instructing Northern Ireland not to give me housing. And so for the first few days when I arrived in Northern Ireland, I was homeless. And one of the days, it was so cold, like freezing cold outside. I tried to sleep in a hotel's vestibule. And I think that was, I forget the name of that hotel, which one it was. I think it was the Leonard Hotel, something like that. And I just tried to get out of the cold for a moment. And when I did so, and I tried to lay down in the vestibule, a security guard actually picked me up and threw me out of the vestibule. Ladies and gentlemen, do you see like there's a pattern of violence that is being perpetrated by men working in security who have a connection to intelligence? And all these incidents, they were able to harm me. They were able to violently put their hands on me. They were permitted to assault me, and I couldn't protect myself. And not only could I not protect myself, but I didn't have anyone to protect me. And this is what encompasses radical victimology, where we have victims of police force, victims of the state, victims of oppression, who often are not seen as victims, and then their perpetrator is persons that never, if ever, see the inside of a jail cell? Never, if ever, charges are brought against them? Now, let's go back to my time at Queen's University. So we summed up pretty much the cyber psychopathy and the cyber aspect of this discussion, but I want to go back to my time at Queen's University, and let's use Niall Christie's framework, the ideal victim framework, the 5 attributes, and let's ask ourselves, if I was an ideal victim in that situation. First, the victim is weak. Well, compared to men working in intelligence agencies, compared to men having cyber criminal or men engaged in cyber criminality, I think we could support the argument that I'm weak compared to these men or to these persons working in intelligence agencies. Let's look at that a little bit deeper. In a number of the videos that I posted, I expound on how the cyber hackers' behavior appears to be very racialized, and that there is likely a white nationalist on the other side of my screen. And to be sure, ladies and gentlemen, we know that there are men in intelligence that are connected to neo-Nazism, as we see with, and as we have read in Daniel DeSimone's piece, and even within the United States of America, the FBI's own research showed over a course of a time where people with white supremacist beliefs and that kind of ideology had infiltrated law enforcement. So I don't think that it is outside the realm of possibility to make the conclusion that there was a pattern of racialized harassment that I had experienced online. When we look at the prejudice plus power formula, we see that in order to practice racism, you need to have 2 things. You need to have prejudice plus power. And there is an argument that Black Americans cannot practice racism because we don't have power. And so I believe that that thesis is 100% true. Now let's look at it. Prejudice plus power. In order to practice racism, well, the men working in cyber intelligence, as well as their proxies working, the proxies could be cyber hackers that intelligence agencies may groom from universities and teach them how to hack a device, or maybe they learn this in university, and then these intelligence agencies such as Enzo Recruitment will recruit these students from the university and send them to places like Nisos Group Limited, and they engage in this cyber hacking for Nisos. And what's regrettable is that most of the time they're given a narrative which urges them and compels them, propels them even to attack this person by hacking into their devices and harassing them over a period of time. And most of the time, especially in my case, that narrative has been a very racialized one. And so that is the prejudice. Now, power. What is the power? Power is the very fact that these proxies, as well as these men working in intelligence, and sometimes there are women, but most of the time they are men working in intelligence and engaging in hacking, are supported by an institution such as the CIA, the FBI, the MI5, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the National Crime Agency. The list goes on and on and on. And I think what's disturbing here is that we see this formula come alive before our eyes. We have the prejudice and the power being back. So the power is the person that is supported by these agencies carrying out acts of racism. And so, going back to Niall Christie's 5 attributes, was I carrying out a project that could be seen as a very respectful one? And the answer to that is yes. I was a student in the university. I was researching an issue of significant public interest, such as state crime, transnational repression, and I had persons hacking into my student accounts at Queen's University, Belfast. They deleted 500 words from my assessment to bring my mark down. And then in other instances, they were capturing the 2-factor authentication code. So for example, when I would go into put in the authentication code through that application, they would intercept that code and have me locked out of my student account for minutes. And I guess what they were doing was reading information within my student account or intercepting communications. And then I had to enter in another code. What is that? I had to enter in another code. And this happened time and time and time, that I visited the security at Queen's University, Belfast, the IT personnel, and I asked them, hey, could I not have this 2-factor authentication to log into my student account? I'm going to create a very robust password. And they were like, no, you need to have that code, which leads me to believe that they were complicit. And they knew that this was happening. The evidence demonstrates that they knew that this was happening, and they ignored it time and time again. So going back to that, was I carrying out a project that could be seen with respect? Yes. Student in a university, engaged in research at the master's level. Was I in a place that I could not be blamed for being? I was in a place where I could not be blamed for being. I was in the university. I was in the library. I was engaged in critical research. There was no reason why any of this should have happened. The only explanation as to why this happened was because of transnational repression. let's give it another overview. Had this been primarily individual cyber hackers, that in and of itself would have not been enough to push me out of the university. Had this been a foreign nation that I had no connection to, meaning that I was not a citizen of or had not visited their country, there is no way that that could have been the impetus that compelled the university to put sanctions on me and to impede me from writing my dissertation. The credible evidence leads to the Irish government and the US government stopping my dissertation on transnational repression because this research was about them. And if we entertained the argument that a foreign nation engaged in this behavior, they only did it for the states that I was writing about. So let's say, for instance, we're entertaining the argument that this was somehow Israel or China or Russia or Turkey or whatever country you want to name, any country, Egypt, any country you want to name. Well, the United States and the Irish government gave them permission to do that. If that was an argument, I don't entertain that argument whatsoever. But if people want to entertain that argument, then they only could have engaged in that with the permission of the United States of America or the Irish government, Northern Ireland. The offender was big and a bad person, right? Here, the offenders are men working in intelligence. And some may not be seen as bigger than me in physicality, but when we look at their position, the fact that they have legitimate power, coercive power, referent power, reward power. I'm refraining from saying expert power because I don't think that there is an expertise that they're using in this particular situation. And if they are using their expertise, they're misusing it and abusing it. So we have all these forms of power that they're using to engage in a campaign of harassment and victimization. And remember, going back to the formula, prejudice plus power. And that is how they're able to carry out this racism. And so in my particular situation, were these intelligence operatives big and bad? Yes, they were. Yes, they are. They're big because they work inside intelligence agencies. They're bad because they are partaking in state crime. Lastly, the offender was unknown and does not have a personal relationship to me. In my particular situation, I can't say that this person is the perpetrator behind the computer, and I don't think any of us can do that. I don't think that if your computer is hacked or if your cell phone is hacked, you're able to take your phone to the police department and tell them, oh yeah, it was George Michael that did it, or it was this person or that person that did it. You're not able to identify the information. Identify the person. And this is what leads me to believe, and this is the critical piece of evidence that demonstrates that intelligence agencies and police departments such as the PSNI are actively engaged in this kind of activity. To be sure, when I called the Police Service of Northern Ireland and reported that my cell phone was hacked, they engaged in a number of questions. Well, how do you know it's hacked? And then when I explained, well, I know my cell phone is hacked because first, when I went to put in, or when I signed up for an account with prepaid financial services to check the balance on my Aspen card and to look at the transaction history, HTML code popped up on my screen, and those credentials were intercepted because when I tried to log in with just my username and password, it stated retrieve the code from the email address that we sent it to. And at no time during that process did I ever put in an email address. At no time during that process. Not once did it give me a prompt to include an email address. So my account, the credentials were intercepted, and someone attached an email address to that account to where they could view those transactions or alter those transactions. The same day, I reported the credentials of the card stolen. I reported it to the Police Service of Northern Ireland, to reiterate, and Migrant Help. The question that they asked, I will restate, is, well, how do you know that your phone was hacked? And so that was a critical piece of evidence that I explained to them. Another piece of evidence that I explained to them is that whenever I go to try and update my phone won't update. So that's two. Because we know when there is spyware or malware on a person's phone, the malware or the persons that are applying that malware on that person's phone will prevent the phone from updating, because oftentimes when the phone updates, that malware is removed in some instances. I'm not a IT expert, and I don't have a lot of information about that, but that's what I've been told. Third, so that was first, and then second. And then third, I said, well, I noticed that whenever I send communications to journalists and organizations and human rights bodies, that those communications are never responded to. And sometimes it'll take months. And when I look, well, I'll give it months. And when I look back, that communication is never responded to. I said, that's evidence that there is some kind of program on my phone and that a person is intercepting my communications. One communication, okay, well, that person may not have wanted to respond. Maybe they're too busy. 3 communications, well, maybe 3 people are too busy to answer the communication, right? But when you have 10 or more people not responding to your communication, that is a pattern, and that's a practice that points to intercepting the communications. And this has happened across various platforms, from Facebook, Messenger, from email accounts. The list goes on. I have even created alternate email accounts like the PSNI told me to do, to test whether or not there would be a response to those communications. And when I did so, there was still no response. And so every time I put a piece of evidence in front of the police service in Northern Ireland or the National Crime Agency or the Gardaí, what would they do? They would move the goalpost so that they would not have to investigate my claims. Move the goalpost, move the goalpost, move the goalpost. Surprisingly, in one incident, the police service of Northern Ireland told me, do I know the person who hacked my phone? And they told me that I would need to tell them the identity of the person who hacked my phone. And even when I gave them a name, I said, it's possibly Maurice O'Sullivan. There is evidence leading to Nisos Group Limited. Even in those instances where I provided them with suspects, they chose not to investigate. You may say, well, Kiana, how do you know they didn't investigate? Well, because they never ever sat down and had a conversation with me. They never took a report. They not once treated me like a victim that was injured. So this supports the attribute of the state being big and bad, because they're working in these agencies where they can engage in this behavior that makes them bigger than life. I would almost argue. And then not only that, ladies and gentlemen, but it makes them bad because they're engaged in a state crime. And it also supports the fifth attribute, that these persons are unknown to me. I don't know them. And I don't think that you would know them either if this was happening to you. Let's say, for instance, today somebody hacked your device. Realistically, the information that you can give the police, if you didn't hand over your passwords and if you weren't using an unsecured network, the information that you can give the police is that somehow information was removed from your devices, or spyware was put on your device, or communications were intercepted, but you couldn't tell the police a name of the person who engaged in that behavior. It's the police's responsibility to do that and to catch the culprits and to investigate. To be sure, the Home Office recently arrested 2 persons that had hacked into, I believe, the transport in London's systems. They investigated that because that was an action, a crime against the state. And so they investigated that because they were harmed by that. The state was harmed. But do they treat victims of cybercrime the same as they treat institutions and agencies and departments that are on the receiving end of this cyber psychopathy and this cyber criminality? That is a question that is yet to be answered, and perhaps we'll talk about that in the next video. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Tell me what you think. Do you think that I was the ideal victim at Queen's University, Belfast, do you think that the state had any reasonable grounds to hack into my devices and to push me out of the university? Do you believe that transnational repression is a clear and present danger to journalists, researchers, and human rights defenders, even in Belfast, the Republic of Ireland, today? Do you think that there should be legislation that protects researchers and protects human rights defenders and students who are engaged in critical research that exposes state crimes? And should the state be allowed to set up shop in a university like Queen's University, Belfast, and to spend every day harassing a student who is engaged in critical research? All of these questions I want to know. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.